The stars looked cold and distant from the bridge of the human ship called Hope 1 as Captain Hanwoo stared out at the massive alien space station floating before them. The station was bigger than any city on Earth, with strange crystal towers that glowed with purple light and metal structures that seemed to twist and bend in impossible ways. This was Nexus Prime, the heart of the Galactic Empire and the most important place in the known galaxy. Hanwoo had been chosen to lead humanity's first diplomatic mission to meet the aliens, not because he was the smartest or the strongest, but because he could stay calm when everything around him was falling apart. He had proven this during the Mars colony crisis when pirates attacked, and he managed to save 3,000 people with only 2 broken ships and a crew that had never seen real combat. The aliens had been watching Earth for 6 months now. Their giant ships appeared in the sky one day without warning and just stayed. They're like dark clouds that never moved away. At first people panicked, thinking it was an invasion, but the aliens did nothing except send one simple message to every radio and television on the planet. They wanted to talk to Earth's leaders, and they gave humanity exactly 30 days to send representatives to their space station. Dr. Sujin was the first person to figure out what the aliens really wanted. She had been studying their radio signals since they arrived and noticed something strange about the way they communicated. The aliens always talked like they were giving orders to children. They never asked questions or showed any curiosity about human culture. Instead, they just stated facts and expected humans to accept them. Without question, Sujin had worked with alien languages before, but these were different. Every other species humanity had encountered through radio signals from deep space showed some kind of emotion or personality in their communications. These aliens sounded like computer programs that had learned to speak. They talked about conquering and ruling and controlling, but never about friendship or cooperation or even simple trade. When the alien message finally came, it was exactly what Sujin had expected. The voice was cold and mechanical, speaking perfect English but with no feeling behind the words. The message was simple and terrifying. The Galactic Empire had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. They had conquered 700 star systems and destroyed any species that refused to bow down to their power. Now they were offering humanity the same choice that had been given to countless other worlds: submit to the Empire and live as slaves, or refuse and be wiped out completely. The Emperor of the Galactic Empire was a creature called Thexmore, who belonged to a species known as the Vorthek. The Vorthek were tall beings made of living crystal, who could speak directly into other people's minds without using words. They had evolved on a world where only the strongest and most ruthless survived, and they had built their entire civilization around the idea that might makes right. Thexmore had personally overseen the conquest of over 200 worlds and had never met a species that could resist the Empire's power for more than a few months. The pattern was always the same. The Empire would arrive with their massive fleets and advanced weapons. The local species would try to fight back with whatever primitive technology they had developed. The Empire would demonstrate their overwhelming superiority, and the conquered species would surrender. What made the Vorthek so dangerous was not just their technology, but their complete inability to understand other ways of thinking. They had never encountered a species that could adapt and change the way humans could. Every other species in the galaxy had evolved along similar paths, developing 1 or 2 major advantages and then building their entire civilization around those strengths. The Vorthak had developed telepathy and crystal-based technology. The Zephyrians had developed energy manipulation. The Chronarch had developed perfect memory storage, but humans were different. Humans had evolved as hunters on a world that was constantly changing. They had learned to use tools and work together, and most importantly, they had learned to think in ways that no other species could imagine. Where other species saw problems, humans saw puzzles to be solved. Where other species saw enemies, humans saw challenges to be overcome. The human delegation that traveled to Nexus Prime was carefully chosen to represent the best of what humanity had to offer. Hanwoo was the military representative, showing that humans understood the reality of war. Ambassador Jin'e was the diplomatic representative, proving that humans could negotiate and find peaceful solutions. Dr. Sujin was the scientific representative demonstrating that humans were not just primitive savages, but intelligent beings capable of understanding complex ideas. When their ship docked at Nexus Prime, the humans were immediately surrounded by guards from a dozen different alien species. All of them had been conquered by the Empire and now served as soldiers and workers and administrators. The humans noticed something important about these conquered species. They all moved the same way, talked the same way, and even seemed to think the same way. The Empire had not just conquered their worlds, but had also crushed their spirits. The throne room of Emperor Thexmore was designed to intimidate visitors. It was a massive chamber with walls made of black crystal that reflected light in strange ways, making everything look twisted and unreal. The ceiling was so high that it disappeared into darkness, and the floor was polished to mirror brightness so that visitors felt like they were walking on empty space. Emperor Thexmore himself was 12 feet tall and made entirely of purple crystal that pulsed with inner light. His voice when he spoke was like the sound of breaking glass, and he did not bother to use words, instead pushing his thoughts directly into the minds of anyone near him. The message he sent to the human delegation was simple and brutal. He showed them images of worlds that had been destroyed by the Empire, entire planets turned into lifeless rocks because their inhabitants had refused to surrender. He showed them the fate of species that had tried to resist, beautiful civilizations reduced to ash and dust. In a matter of days, he showed them the power of the Imperial fleet. Millions of ships, each one capable of destroying a planet. Then he made his offer. Humanity could join the Empire as a conquered species. They would be allowed to live, but only as servants and workers. Their planet would be strip-mined for resources. Their children would be taken away to be trained as soldiers for the Empire. Their culture and history would be erased and replaced with Imperial doctrine. They would exist only to serve the greater glory of the Vorthak. Alternative was simple and final: complete extinction. Every human being on every world would be killed. Their planet would be destroyed. Their species would be wiped from the galaxy as if they had never existed. The Empire had done this before to species that refused to accept their place in the natural order. Captain Hyanwu listened to all of this without showing any emotion on his face. He had trained for this moment his entire life, knowing that someday humanity would encounter something that wanted to destroy them. But he had also learned something important about bullies during his years in the military. They always expected their victims to be afraid, and when someone refused to show fear, it made them nervous. Ambassador Janae spoke for the human delegation when the Emperor finished his threats. She stood up slowly and looked directly at the crystal being who ruled most of the galaxy. Her voice was calm and steady as she delivered humanity's response. The humans thanked the Emperor for his generous offer and promised to take his message back to Earth for consideration. They asked for exactly one solar cycle to make their decision. Just as the Emperor had specified, they promised to return with an answer that would satisfy the Empire. What Janae did not say was that humanity had already made their decision. The moment they learned about the Galactic Empire and its history of conquest and destruction, every human leader had agreed on one thing: they would never bow down to anyone who demanded their freedom in exchange for their lives. The human delegation returned to their ship and began the journey back to Earth. As they traveled through space, Captain Hyanwu sent a coded message to every human colony and outpost in the solar system. The message was short, but it would change the course of galactic history. The message said simply, "The Empire thinks we are weak because we are different. They are about to learn that different does not mean inferior. Humanity has survived ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters that would have destroyed any other species. We do not just survive, we thrive, and we are going to show them what happens when you threaten the one species in the galaxy that refuses to stay down." The war between humanity and the Galactic Empire was about to begin. The moment Captain Hyanwu returned to Earth, the entire planet transformed into something the galaxy had never seen before. Every human being, from the oldest grandparent to the youngest child, understood that they were facing the end of everything they had ever known, but instead of panicking or giving up, humanity did what it had always done best: they got to work. General Teho had been preparing for this day since the alien ships first appeared in Earth's sky. He had spent months studying every piece of information they could gather about the Galactic Empire, and he had discovered something that made him smile. The Empire was incredibly powerful, but they were also incredibly predictable. They had been winning battles the same way for thousands of years, and they had never needed to change their tactics. The Empire fought like a giant machine. Everything was planned in advance with massive fleets, moving in perfect formation and overwhelming firepower, destroying any resistance. They had conquered so many worlds that they had forgotten what it was like to fight someone who could think differently. They expected their enemies to line up in neat rows and wait to be destroyed. But Tejo had learned something important during his years fighting pirates and raiders in the outer colonies. The best way to beat someone bigger and stronger than you was to make them fight on your terms, not theirs. And he had an idea that would change everything. The key discovery came from an unexpected source. Minsu was 20 years old and had been hacking computer systems since he was 12 years old. When the alien signals started reaching Earth, he had been one of the first people to figure out how to decode them. Most adults thought he was just playing games, but Minsu had actually been mapping the entire communication network of the Galactic Empire. What he found was amazing. The Empire had built the most advanced communication system in the galaxy. Every planet, every ship, every military base was connected to a central hub on the capital world of Nexus Prime. Information could travel instantly across thousands of light years, and the Emperor could give orders to any part of his domain without delay. The Empire thought this was their greatest strength. They could coordinate attacks across multiple star systems and respond to threats anywhere in the galaxy within minutes. But Minsu saw something else. He saw the biggest weakness in galactic history. The entire empire was controlled by a single network, and if someone could get inside that network, they could control everything. Dr. So Young was the smartest computer scientist on Earth, and when Minsu showed her his discovery, she immediately understood what they could do. They could not build ships as big as the Empire's or weapons as powerful as theirs, but they could do something that no other species had ever attempted. They could turn the Empire's own technology against them. Working together, they created something they called the Trojan Protocol. It was not a virus that would destroy the Empire's computers. Instead, it was a piece of software that would hide inside the Empire's own systems and learn everything about how they worked. The beauty of their creation was that it looked exactly like the kind of software the Empire used to make their communications more efficient. Empire's computers would actually help spread the Trojan Protocol, thinking it was improving their own performance. The software would copy itself to every system it touched, and each copy would start learning about the local networks and defenses. Within months, the humans would know everything about the Empire's military capabilities, their ship designs, their weapon systems, and most importantly, their battle plans. But getting the Trojan Protocol into the Empire's network was going to be the hardest part. They needed someone to carry it directly to Nexus Prime and upload it to the central communication hub without anyone noticing. Captain Han Wu volunteered for the mission, even though everyone knew it was probably a suicide run. The plan was perfect in its simplicity. Han Wu would return to Nexus Prime with humanity's official response to the Emperor's ultimatum. Hidden in the diplomatic data packet would be the Trojan Protocol disguised as standard formatting code. The Empire's own security systems would scan the message and find nothing suspicious, because technically, there was nothing suspicious to find. While Han Wu prepared for his return trip to Nexus Prime, the rest of humanity was working on the second part of their plan. Dr. Yunji had been studying the Empire's history, and she had noticed something important. Every species they had conquered had tried to fight them in space using traditional military tactics. But humans were going to do something completely different. Instead of building a huge fleet to fight the Empire's ships, humanity was going to become invisible. They were going to scatter across the galaxy and hide among the billions of conquered peoples who already lived under imperial rule. The Empire was so large and contained so many different species that it would be impossible to find humans who were trying to blend in. The evacuation of Earth began in secret, using every ship humanity could build or buy. Families were separated and sent to different parts of the galaxy with instructions to find work on imperial worlds and wait for further orders. Children were given new identities and taught to speak alien languages. Adults learned to mimic the behavior of conquered species. Each evacuation ship carried a small group of humans to a different star system on the edge of Imperial space. These worlds were perfect hiding places because they were too remote and unimportant for the Empire to watch closely. The humans would land, claim to be refugees from some distant disaster, and disappear into the crowds of workers and servants that kept the Empire running. Captain Hyanwoo's second trip to Nexus Prime was very different from his first. The alien guards were more suspicious and the security checks were more thorough. But the humans had prepared for this. They had created a perfect cover story about Earth's decision to surrender, and Hanwoo played his part perfectly when he was brought before Emperor Thexmore again. The crystal being seemed pleased. The human captain spoke with a defeated voice about how Earth's leaders had realized they could not fight the mighty Empire. He handed over the official surrender document along with detailed information about Earth's military capabilities and population centers. The Emperor read the document with satisfaction. Another species had learned to accept their place in the natural order. The crystal being barely glanced at the data packet that contained the technical specifications. He ordered his computer systems to process the information and add Earth to the list of conquered worlds. At that exact moment, the Trojan Protocol entered the Empire's central network. It immediately began copying itself to every connected system. While disguising its activities as routine maintenance, the software was designed to be patient and careful. It would not do anything suspicious for months while it learned about the Empire's defenses, and capability. Shenwu was allowed to return to Earth to oversee the official surrender ceremony, but when his ship reached the solar system, he found something that shocked even him. The planet was completely empty. Every human being had vanished without a trace. Cities stood empty with lights still burning and machines still running, but there was no sign of life anywhere. The evacuation had been completed 3 days ahead of schedule. The last transport ship had left Earth's orbit just hours before. Hanwoo arrived carrying the final group of humans to their new hiding places across the galaxy. In the empty city's automated systems continued to broadcast fake radio signals and generate false heat signatures to make it look like people were still living there, hidden in an asteroid belt near Mars. A small monitoring station watched as Imperial scout ships began arriving at Earth. The aliens found exactly what the humans wanted them to find: a defeated world with a broken population ready to serve their new masters. The Empire's sensors detected millions of life signs and intercepted radio transmissions that sounded like normal human activities, but it was all fake. The life signs came from biological samples left behind by the evacuees. The radio transmissions were computer-generated. The humans had created the perfect illusion of a conquered world while their real population was already spreading across the galaxies in the wind within 6 months. Humans were working on Imperial worlds throughout the galaxy. They took jobs as mechanics and clerks and janitors and guards. They learned alien languages and customs and ways of thinking. They became invisible parts of the Empire's vast machinery while secretly reporting everything they saw and heard. The Trojan Protocol was now fully active across the Empire's network. Every secret communication, every military order, every strategic plan was being copied and sent to human commanders hiding in the outer rim. The Empire thought they had conquered Earth, but they had actually allowed humanity to infiltrate their entire civilization. General Tejo received reports from human agents on hundreds of worlds. The Empire was even larger and more powerful than they had imagined, but it was also more fragile. The conquered species were held in line by fear and the threat of overwhelming force. If that fear could be broken, if those conquered peoples could be shown that the Empire was not invincible, then everything would change. The war between humanity and the Galactic Empire was about to begin, but it would not be fought the way anyone expected. It would be fought with information and infiltration, and the one thing that humans understood better than any other species in the galaxy: the power of hope. The Imperial fleet that arrived at Earth 1 year later was the most impressive military force ever assembled in the galaxy. 3,000 ships, each one bigger than the largest human cities, filled the space around the small blue planet. The sight was meant to terrify any remaining resistance and force immediate surrender. But the Empire was about to learn that humans did not scare easily. Admiral Sao Jun commanded the defense of Earth from a hidden base on the far side of the moon. The human fleet looked pathetic compared to the Empire's massive armada. Only 200 ships built in secret over the past year faced an invasion force that had conquered half the galaxy, but these were not ordinary ships, and the people who flew them were not ordinary soldiers. Every human pilot knew they were going to die. They had volunteered for this mission understanding that their job was not to win the battle, but to send a message to the galaxy. The message was simple: humanity would not go quietly into the dark, and anyone who wanted to destroy them would pay a price they had never imagined. Battle began exactly as the Empire expected. The human ships moved into defensive positions around Earth and waited for the Imperial fleet to attack. The alien commanders were confident this was the same pattern they had seen on hundreds of worlds. A desperate last stand by a species that refused to accept reality. Emperor Vexmore watched the battle from his flagship, confident that it would be over within hours. The human ships were tiny compared to his massive dreadnoughts, and their primitive weapons could not possibly penetrate Imperial shields. He gave the order to attack, expecting to add another easy victory to his long list of conquests, but the humans had spent the entire year studying every battle the Empire had ever fought. They knew exactly how the Imperial fleet would attack, and they had prepared accordingly. The first surprise came when the human ships did not fire their weapons. Instead, they launched what looked like simple metal projectiles moving at incredible speed. The Imperial commanders barely noticed these primitive kinetic weapons. Their advanced sensors dismissed them as harmless chunks of metal that would bounce off their energy shields. But these were not ordinary projectiles. Each one contained a small fusion reactor set to overload the moment it made contact with an enemy ship. When the first projectile struck an Imperial dreadnought, it created a miniature star. The explosion was so bright that it could be seen from Earth's surface, and so powerful that it vaporized the entire front section of the massive ship. The Imperial fleet suddenly found themselves under attack by weapons that turned their own size against them. The larger the ship, the more damage it took when one of the human fusion projectiles hit it. The Empire's biggest vessels, which were designed to intimidate enemies with their sheer size, became easy targets for weapons that fed on mass and energy. The human projectiles did not just destroy ships, they consumed them. Admiral Seogen had learned an important lesson from studying the Empire's history. Every species they had conquered had tried to fight them using conventional tactics: big ships against big ships, energy weapons against energy, shields formation flying against formation flying, but humans were going to fight differently. The second surprise came when the human ships began moving in ways that defied every rule of space combat. Instead of maintaining neat formations, they scattered like a flock of birds attacked by a hawk. Each ship moved independently, using the debris from destroyed Imperial vessels as cover and concealment. Human pilots had trained for this moment their entire lives. They knew every trick that pirates and raiders had ever used, and they had invented dozens of new ones. They flew their ships like fighters instead of warships, diving and weaving through the Imperial fleet, causing chaos and confusion wherever they went. Every human ship was equipped with the same simple strategy: do as much damage as possible before being destroyed, and make sure that damage hurt the pilots targeted the Empire's communication arrays, their sensor networks, their command centers, anything that would make it harder for the Imperial fleet to coordinate their attacks. Captain Minho, flying a ship called Earth's Fury, managed to crash his vessel directly into the bridge of an Imperial command ship. The collision killed him instantly, but it also destroyed the communication center that was coordinating attacks for an entire battle group. Without their command ship, the Imperial vessels began firing on each other. In the confusion, the battle lasted 3 days, and when it ended, the Imperial fleet had achieved their objective. Earth was conquered, and the human fleet was completely destroyed. But the victory felt hollow. The Empire had lost over 800 ships to defeat a force less than a tenth their size. They had never experienced casualties like this in any previous conquest. More disturbing to the Imperial commanders was what they found when they landed on Earth. The planet was completely empty. Every human being had vanished, leaving behind only empty cities and automated systems, still broadcasting fake signals. The Empire had conquered a ghost world. The single message that played on every communication channel was simple and terrifying: This was just the beginning. Emperor Thexmore was furious. He had expected an easy victory against a primitive species. Instead, he had lost nearly a quarter of his invasion fleet. The humans had somehow escaped before the battle even began, and now they were hiding somewhere in his own empire. What the Emperor did not know was that the Battle of Earth had been broadcast live to every world in the galaxy. The human agents who had infiltrated Imperial society had made sure that billions of conquered beings watched as a tiny human fleet made the mighty empire bleed. For 10,000 years, the empire had maintained control through fear. Every conquered species believed that resistance was hopeless because no one had ever hurt the imperial fleet. But the humans had proven that the empire could be damaged, that their ships could be destroyed, that their warriors could be defeated. Dr. Sujin watched the battle from a hidden base in the asteroid belt and immediately understood what it meant. The humans had not won the battle, but they had won something more important. They had shown the galaxy that the Empire was not invincible. The news of the Battle of Earth spread across the galaxy faster than the Empire could suppress it. Conquered species who had lived under Imperial rule for generations suddenly began asking questions. If a primitive species like humanity could destroy 800 Imperial ships, what could more advanced civilizations accomplish on a dozen worlds? Riots broke out as conquered peoples demanded answers from their imperial governors. Why had the Empire suffered such heavy casualties against an enemy they claimed was primitive and weak? If the humans could fight back and hurt the Empire, why should other species continue to accept slavery? The imperial response was swift and brutal. Entire cities were destroyed as examples to anyone who might be thinking of rebellion. The Emperor ordered his governors to execute anyone caught spreading news about the Battle of Earth, but the damage was already done. The humans had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of every conquered being in the galaxy. The Empire was powerful, but it was not all-powerful. The Vorthek could be hurt, they could be defeated, and they could be destroyed. Colonel Duhayon received reports from human agents across the galaxy. The Empire was facing unrest on 50 worlds as conquered species began to question their rulers. The Imperial military was being stretched thin as they tried to maintain order while also searching for the missing human population, but the humans were staying hidden. They had learned to blend in with the conquered peoples so well that Imperial security forces could not find them. They worked as mechanics and clerks and servants while secretly preparing for the next phase of their plan. The Trojan protocol was now fully integrated into the Empire's communication network. Every order from the Emperor, every military deployment, every secret plan was being monitored and reported back to human command. The Empire thought they were hunting a defeated enemy, but they were actually being watched by their prey. General Tejo studied the intelligence reports and smiled. The Empire was reacting exactly as he had predicted. They were using more and more force to maintain control, which was making the conquered species more and more angry. The humans had started a fire that would spread across the galaxy. The war between humanity and the Galactic Empire was entering its second phase. The humans had proven they could fight, now they had to prove they could win. But they would not win through superior technology or overwhelming force. They would win by doing what humans had always done best: teaching others to believe in themselves. 2 years after the Battle of Earth, the Galactic Empire was facing something it had never encountered in 10,000 years of conquest. A war that could not be won through superior firepower. The humans were not building massive fleets or establishing grand armies. Instead, they were doing something far more dangerous. They were teaching the galaxy how to think. The changes started small. On worlds far from the Imperial capital, supply convoys would arrive at military bases only to discover that their cargo containers held broken equipment instead of weapons. Communication networks would develop mysterious problems that caused orders to be scrambled or delayed. Entire Imperial battalions would receive conflicting instructions and end up fighting each other instead of maintaining order. Commander Jin Wu had been working undercover as a maintenance technician on the Imperial world of Kepler 7 for 18 months. He looked like any other human slave working in the massive factories that produced weapons for the Empire, but he was actually coordinating sabotage operations across 3 star systems. His job was to make the Empire's own technology unreliable without anyone realizing what was happening. A simple adjustment to a communication relay would cause it to fail during crucial moments. A small modification to a weapon system would make it overheat and shut down during combat inspections. A tiny change to a transport ship's navigation computer would cause it to arrive at the wrong destination. The beauty of Jinwoo's work was that it looked like normal equipment failure. The Empire's engineers would inspect the broken systems and find nothing obviously wrong. They would repair the damage and put the equipment back into service, never realizing that the failures had been deliberately caused. Professor Yunha was conducting an even more sophisticated operation from her hidden laboratory in the Outer Rim. She had been studying the Empire's communication networks for 2 years and had discovered something remarkable the Vorthak had never learned: how to inspire loyalty in their subjects. They maintained control through fear and the threat of violence. Using the Trojan protocol, she had access to every internal communication in the Empire. She could read the private messages between imperial governors and their subordinates. She could monitor the conversations between military commanders and their troops. She could even access the personal files of high-ranking officials. What she found was a civilization that was rotting from within. The Empire looked powerful on the surface, but underneath it was held together by nothing more than habit and terror. The conquered species obeyed their rulers because they had never known anything else, but they did not love them or respect them or believe in the Munha. Began crafting messages designed to exploit the weaknesses she had discovered. She would send anonymous communications to imperial officials that made them suspicious of their own subordinates. She would leak information about corruption and incompetence among the ruling class. She would spread rumors that made different factions within the Empire distrust each other. The goal was not to cause immediate rebellion, but to slowly erode the confidence that held the Empire together. She wanted imperial officials to start questioning their own system, to wonder if their rulers were as wise and powerful as they claimed to. Beatty breakthrough came when Captain Jae-min discovered something that changed everything about the human resistance. He had been working as a translator in the Imperial Senate for over a year, listening to the debates between representatives from different conquered worlds. His job was to help the alien delegates understand each other's languages, but what he actually heard was far more interesting than anyone expected. The conquered species were not happy with their situation. They resented their Vorthak overlords and dreamed of freedom, but they had never dared to express these feelings openly because they believed the Empire was too powerful to resist. The battle of Earth had changed that calculation. For the first time in galactic history, someone had hurt the Empire badly enough to make them bleed. The human fleet had been destroyed, but they had taken 800 Imperial ships with them, and that victory had captured the imagination of every oppressed being in the galaxy. Jae-min began secretly meeting with representatives from other conquered worlds. He did not reveal that he was human. Instead, he presented himself as a member of a previously unknown species that had been enslaved by the Empire, but had managed to maintain their independence. Through careful planning and coordination, the aliens were fascinated by his stories of successful resistance. They wanted to know how his people had managed to avoid the fate of other conquered species. He told them about the importance of patience and planning, about the need to work together across species lines, and about the power of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Within months, Jae-min had helped establish a secret network of resistance cells on dozens of worlds. The members came from every species in the Empire, and they all shared the same goal: freedom from Vorthak rule. They called themselves the Liberation Front, and they began coordinating their activities across the galaxy. The human agents provided intelligence and expertise, while the alien rebels provided local knowledge and manpower. Together, they began launching coordinated attacks on Imperial infrastructure, targeting communication centers, transportation hubs, and administrative buildings. The Empire's response was predictable and counterproductive. Imperial governors ordered massive crackdowns on any world that showed signs of unrest. They arrested thousands of suspected rebels and executed hundreds of people as examples to others, but these brutal measures only made the resistance stronger. Dr. Yoonji had predicted this reaction years earlier. She knew that the Empire's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. The Vorthak had ruled for so long through fear that they had forgotten how to rule through respect or admiration. When faced with rebellion, their only response was more violence. But Violence without purpose only created more rebels. Every innocent person executed by the Empire became a martyr for the resistance movement. Every family destroyed by Imperial forces became a source of new recruits for the Liberation Front. The Empire was creating its own enemies. The turning point came when the resistance managed to capture an entire Imperial communications center on the mining world of Zarian 4. The facility contained detailed information about the Empire's military deployments, their supply lines, and their strategic plans. Human technicians working with alien engineers managed to download the entire database. Before Imperial reinforcements arrived, the information was immediately transmitted to resistance cells across the galaxy, giving them unprecedented insight into the Empire's operations. For the first time in galactic history, the conquered species knew as much about the Empire's movements as the Empire knew about theirs. The balance of power was beginning to shift. Colonel Yu Haiyan received a message that made him smile. The resistance had successfully coordinated simultaneous attacks on Imperial facilities in 12 different star systems. The attacks had been perfectly timed to cause maximum disruption while minimizing casualties among the conquered populations. The Empire was being forced to spread their forces thinner and thinner as they tried to maintain control over increasingly rebellious worlds. Military units that should have been preparing for external threats were instead being used to suppress internal dissent. But the most important change was psychological. The conquered species were no longer afraid. They had seen that the Empire could be hurt, could be confused, could be defeated. They had learned that the Vorthok were not gods, but simply another species that had gotten lucky and stayed in power longer than they deserved. The human resistance had accomplished something that seemed impossible. Just a few years earlier, they had taught an entire galaxy how to fight back. They had shown billions of oppressed beings that freedom was possible if they were willing to work together and never give up. The war between humanity and the Galactic Empire was entering its final phase. The humans had proven they could survive the Empire's initial attack. They had proven they could hide within the Empire's own territory. And they had proven they could inspire others to join their cause. Now they had to prove they could win. But victory would not come through military conquest. It would come through something far more powerful. The realization that the Empire's subjects no longer believed in their rulers and were ready to choose freedom over security. The galaxy was about to change forever, and it was all because a species that the Empire had dismissed as primitive and weak had refused to accept defeat. They had taught the galaxy that the most powerful force in the universe was not superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but the simple belief that every being deserved to be free. 3 years after the Battle of Earth, the Galactic Empire was falling apart from the inside. Emperor Thexmore sat in his crystal throne room, reading reports that would have been impossible to imagine just a few years earlier. Rebellions were breaking out on over 200 worlds simultaneously. Imperial supply lines were collapsing, and worst of all, his own governors were beginning to question his authority. The humans had not fired a single shot in over a year, but they were winning the war more decisively than any military victory could have achieved. They had turned the Empire's greatest strength, its vast size and complexity, into its greatest weakness. Every world, every system, every species was now a potential source of rebellion. Captain Su Jin had been working as a communications officer on the Imperial capital world of Nexus Prime for 2 years. Nobody suspected that the quiet, efficient human woman who processed routine messages was actually the coordinator of the largest intelligence operation in galactic history. Every day she received hundreds of reports from human agents across the Empire, and every day she sent out carefully crafted instructions that kept the resistance movement growing, the information flowing through her hands was staggering. The humans now knew the location of every Imperial military base, the strength of every garrison, the movement of every supply convoy, and the personal details of every important official in the Empire. They had access to the Emperor's private communications, his military plans, and even his personal fears. But the most valuable intelligence was not about the Empire's military capabilities. It was about the growing discontent among the conquered species. The Trojan Protocol was intercepting millions of private communications every day, and the pattern was clear. The Empire's subjects were no longer afraid of their rulers, they were angry. Dr. Minji had been analyzing these communications from her hidden base in the asteroid belt, and what she found was remarkable. The conquered species were not just complaining about their treatment. They were actively planning coordinated resistance. The humans had provided the spark, but the other species were building their own fires. The Zephyrian workers on the industrial world of Titan Base had organized themselves into secret cells that were sabotaging weapons production. The chronic miners in the Outer Rim were deliberately slowing down their work and hiding valuable resources from their imperial overseers. The Altarian scientists were feeding false information to their Vorthax supervisors, causing critical errors in imperial research projects. What made this rebellion different from previous uprisings was that it was coordinated across species lines. The conquered peoples were no longer fighting as separate groups, they were working together. As a single unified force, the humans had taught them that their differences were strengths, not weaknesses. General Tejo received a report that made him realize the war was almost over. The Imperial military was requesting emergency reinforcements for over 300 worlds simultaneously. The Empire simply did not have enough troops to maintain order across their entire territory. They were being forced to choose which worlds to protect and which ones to abandon. The human strategy was working perfectly. The Empire had always maintained control through the threat of overwhelming force, but that threat was meaningless if they could not be everywhere at once. By spreading the rebellion across the entire galaxy, the humans had made it impossible for the Empire to respond effectively, but the most important change was happening in the minds of the conquered species themselves. They were no longer thinking like slaves, they were thinking like free beings. They were making their own decisions, choosing their own leaders, and planning their own futures. Commander Hyunsu had been working with the resistance on the agricultural world of Green Valley. For 18 months, he had watched as the local population transformed from fearful subjects into confident rebels. The change was not just political, it was psychological. The people were standing taller, speaking louder, and looking their imperial overseers in the eye. The breakthrough came when the resistance managed to capture an entire imperial garrison without firing a single shot. The human agents had spent months spreading rumors about the garrison commander's corruption and incompetence. The local population had lost all respect for their rulers, and when the resistance called for the garrison to surrender, the imperial troops simply laid down their weapons. Similar bloodless victories were happening across the galaxy. Imperial officials were finding themselves isolated and powerless as their own subjects refused to obey their orders. The Empire was not being destroyed by superior force, it was being dissolved by the loss of legitimacy. Emperor Vexmore finally understood what he was facing when his own palace guard began asking questions about the Empire's policies. The crystal being had ruled through fear and intimidation for centuries, but fear was no longer enough. His subjects wanted explanations, they wanted justifications, they wanted to understand why they should continue to serve rulers who seemed to care nothing for their welfare. The Emperor's response was typical of his species. He ordered massive military crackdowns on rebellious worlds and threatened to destroy entire planets if they did not submit, but these threats only made the situation worse. The conquered species were no longer impressed by displays of force, they were disgusted by them. Dr. Yunha intercepted a communication that revealed the Empire's desperation. The Emperor was privately asking his advisors how many worlds they could afford to lose before the Empire collapsed completely. The answer was terrifying: less than 50. The Empire needed the resources and manpower of the conquered worlds to maintain their military power. The human plan was entering its final phase. They had proven that the Empire could be hurt, they had shown that resistance was possible, and they had taught the galaxy that freedom was worth fighting for. Now they had to deliver the killing blow. The message came simultaneously to every world in the galaxy, transmitted through the Empire's own communication network. Every screen, every speaker, every communication device displayed the same image: a human woman sitting calmly at a desk, speaking directly to the camera. President Jihai had been elected by the human survivors to serve as their spokesperson. She had been chosen not for her military experience, but for her ability to inspire hope in desperate situations. Her message to the galaxy was simple but powerful. She spoke directly to every conquered being in the empire, telling them that their suffering was not inevitable, that their rulers were not gods, and that they deserved to be free. She reminded them that the empire had been built on the backs of slaves and could only survive as long as those slaves continued to accept their fate, but, most importantly, she gave them a choice. They could continue to serve masters who despised them, or they could join together and build something better. The technology to coordinate their resistance was already in place. The human agents would provide whatever support was needed, and the time for half measures was over. The response was immediate and overwhelming. On over 400 worlds, the conquered species rose up simultaneously. Imperial garrisons found themselves surrounded by angry populations who outnumbered them by millions to 1. Communication networks were seized, administrative buildings were occupied, and imperial officials were arrested or forced to flee. The Empire's military tried to respond, but they were facing something they had never encountered before: a coordinated, galaxy-wide revolution that was being supported by their own technology. The Trojan Protocol was now actively helping the rebels by disrupting imperial communications and providing real-time intelligence about military movements. Within 6 months, the Galactic Empire had lost control of over half their territory. The remaining imperial forces were concentrated around the core worlds, but they were cut off from their supply lines and facing constant attacks from all sides. Emperor Dexmor made one final desperate attempt to maintain his power. He ordered the destruction of several rebellious worlds, hoping that the threat of genocide would force the other species back into submission. But the galaxy had learned too much about freedom to be intimidated by threats. The humans had accomplished something that seemed impossible. They had taught an entire galaxy that the most powerful force in the universe was not superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but the simple belief that every being deserved to live free. The war between humanity and the Galactic Empire was almost over, but the real victory was not military, it was philosophical. The galaxy would never again accept the rule of tyrants who claimed power through force alone. The age of empires was ending, and the age of freedom was about to begin. The end of the Galactic Empire came not with a great explosion or a massive battle, but with a simple message that changed everything. President Jihai appeared on every screen in the galaxy at exactly the same moment, speaking calmly to billions of beings who had never imagined they could be free. 5 years had passed since the Battle of Earth, and the galaxy was completely different. The Empire still existed on paper, but it controlled fewer than 50 worlds, and most of those were in open rebellion. The conquered species had learned to think for themselves, and they were not interested in returning to Slava. Jihai had been chosen by the human survivors to speak for them, because she understood something that military leaders often forgot. Wars were not won by destroying enemies, they were won by changing minds. The humans had not defeated the Empire through superior force, they had defeated it by teaching the galaxy to believe in something better. Her message was broadcast simultaneously to every world in the galaxy using the Empire's own communication. NETWORK. The Trojan Protocol had grown over the years from a simple spy program into something far more powerful. It had become the nervous system of a new kind of civilization, one based on cooperation instead of domination. She began by speaking directly to the conquered species, telling them that their long nightmare was finally over. The Empire's power was broken not because the humans had destroyed it, but because the galaxy had chosen to stop supporting it. The Vorthak could no longer rule because their subjects refused to be ruled, but she also spoke to the Vorthak themselves, acknowledging that they were not evil by nature, but had been trapped by their own history. They had built their civilization on the idea that might makes right and had never learned any other way to live. She offered them a choice: they could continue fighting a war they had already lost, or they could join the new galaxy that was being born. The response was immediate and overwhelming. On world after world, the remaining imperial forces laid down their weapons and surrendered. The conquered species, who had been preparing for massive battles, found themselves accepting the surrender of their former masters. Instead of fighting them, Emperor Dexmor himself was found in his crystal throne room on Nexus Prime, sitting alone and powerless. The massive palace that had once housed the government of the galaxy was empty except for A few loyal guards who had refused to abandon their posts. The crystal being who had ruled through fear for so long was finally facing the consequences of his choices. When human negotiators arrived to discuss terms of surrender, they found something unexpected. The emperor was not angry or defiant. He was confused. He genuinely did not understand how his empire had fallen apart. He had the strongest military in the galaxy, the most advanced technology, and the most efficient government. Why had his subjects chosen to rebel Captain Haiyan Wu, who had started the war by carrying humanity's defiance to the imperial capital, was the one who explained it to him. The empire had been built on the belief that some beings were naturally superior to others and had the right to rule over them, but the humans had proven that this belief was false. Every species in the galaxy was capable of greatness when given the chance to prove themselves. The conquered peoples had not been inferior to their rulers. They had simply been denied the opportunity to show their true potential. Once they understood that freedom was possible, they had chosen it over security. The transition from empire to federation was not easy or quick. It took years to establish new governments on hundreds of worlds, and even longer to build trust between species that had been enemies for generations. But the humans had learned something important during their war against the empire. The most difficult battles were not fought with weapons, but with ideas. Dr. Sujin became the first director of interspecies relations for the new Galactic Federation. Her job was to help different species learn to work together as equals instead of as masters and servants. She had studied the empire's failures and was determined not to repeat them. The key insight was that diversity was a strength, not a weakness. The empire had tried to make every species conform to Vorthak ideals, but the Federation would celebrate the unique contributions that each species could make. The Zephyrians were master energy manipulators. The Chronarch had perfect memory storage. The Altarians were brilliant scientists, and the humans were expert problem solvers. General Tejo was appointed as the first Supreme Commander of the Federation Defense Force, but his job was very different from an imperial military leader. Instead of conquering and controlling, he was responsible for protecting the freedom that so many beings had fought to achieve. The Federation military was designed to defend against external threats, not to impose internal control. The most challenging task was dealing with the former imperial worlds. Many of the Vorthak had been raised to believe that they were naturally superior to other species and found it difficult to accept equality. Some tried to maintain their old privileges, while others retreated to isolated worlds where they could live according to their traditional ways. But many Vorthak chose to embrace the new order. Captain Jamin worked with former imperial officials who wanted to make amends for their past actions. These reformed Vorthak used their knowledge of imperial technology and administration to help build the Federation's new government. They proved that even the former rulers could change when given the chance. The economic transformation was perhaps the most dramatic change of all. The empire had been based on extraction and exploitation, with conquered worlds forced to send their resources to the imperial core worlds, but the Federation was built on trade and mutual benefit. Each world specialized in what they did best and traded freely with others. The mining worlds that had been stripped bare by imperial demands were given the technology and resources they needed to restore their environments. The agricultural worlds that had been forced to grow only cash crops were allowed to diversify and feed their own populations. The industrial worlds that had produced only weapons began making tools and machines that improved life for everyone. Dr. Minji established the Galactic Research Consortium, where scientists from every species worked together to solve problems that affected the entire galaxy. Disease, poverty, environmental destruction, and resource scarcity were no longer individual problems, but shared challenges that required cooperative solutions. The humans played a special role in the new galaxy, not as rulers but as teachers and mediators. Their experience with diversity and adaptation made them natural ambassadors between species that had trouble understanding each other. They helped establish the cultural exchange programs that allowed different civilizations to learn from each other. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. The beings of the galaxy no longer thought of themselves as subjects or slaves. They thought of themselves as citizens. They had rights and responsibilities. They had voices in their own governance, and They had the power to shape their own destinies. Commander Sujin established the Freedom Memorial on the site where Earth had once orbited. The planet itself was gone destroyed by Imperial forces during the final battles, but the memorial served as a reminder of what had been sacrificed to achieve galactic liberation. The names of every being who had died fighting for freedom were carved into crystal pillars that stretched toward the stars. The memorial's central message was simple: freedom is not a gift that can be given by others, it is a right that must be claimed by each individual and defended by all. The galaxy had learned this lesson at a terrible cost, but it had learned it well 10 years after the end of the Empire. The Galactic Federation included over 800 worlds and was still growing. New species were discovering that they did not have to choose between isolation and conquest. They could join a community of equals that respected their independence while offering mutual support. President Jihai stood before the Federation Council in its new capital on the world of New Harmony and delivered the speech that would define the new age. She spoke about the long journey from slavery to freedom and the responsibility that came with liberty. The galaxy had been given a second chance to build something better, and they could not afford to waste it. The humans had accomplished something that would echo through galactic history for millennia. They had proven that the strongest force in the universe was not superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but the simple belief that every being deserved to live free. They had taught the galaxy that cooperation was more powerful than domination and that diversity was more valuable than uniformity. The war between humanity and the Galactic Empire was over, but the real victory was just beginning. The age of empires had ended, and the age of freedom had begun. The galaxy would never again accept the rule of tyrants, because its people had learned something that could never be taken away from them: the knowledge that they were capable of governing themselves. The memorial on New Earth bore a simple inscription that captured the spirit of the new age. They told us to surrender or die. We chose to live free and taught the galaxy to do the same. The words were written in the languages of every species in the Federation, a reminder that freedom belonged to everyone. As the stars shone down on a galaxy finally at peace, billions of beings looked toward the future with hope instead of fear. They had learned that the universe was big enough for everyone to find their place in that.